13,000 years ago, the sky fell, and history was erased.
Long before recorded time, when ice still gripped the northern world and the stars were not where they are today, there are traces of something lost to civilization older than history, erased by fire, water, and silence. Ancient tablets speak of kings who ruled for thousands of years, of gods who walked among men, and of a flood that ended their reign. Archaeologists call it myth. Yet beneath the ice, in the dust of forgotten cities, and in the symbols carved into stone, the same story returns: a fall that reshaped the world. This is the story of the last Anunnaki king, of a world that perished 13,000 years ago, and of the faint light it left behind in our myths, our monuments, and our blood. Join us as we descend into the silence between civilizations to the place where history began and memory refuses to die. The storm before memory. In the layers of ice beneath Greenland, there is a sudden shift. Microscopic particles of soot, shards of platinum, and traces of iridium mark a moment the Earth itself seemed to stop breathing. Scientists date it to around 10,800 BCE, an event now called the Younger Dryas Impact. But to ancient Mesopotamian tablets, the story begins differently. They speak of a war among the gods, of kingship descending from the heavens, and of one ruler whose fall marked the end of an age, the last Anunnaki king. The name that surfaces across fragments is often Enlil, sometimes Enki, or a third figure one who ruled the southern lands after the flood. The tablets do not agree, yet they share one thing: a memory of sudden silence. Civilization, they say, once stretched from Eridu to the mountains beyond Dilmun. Glowing cities powered not by fire, but by the breath of the sky. The Akkadian word, used Z and Na, is not fully understood, but some scholars translate it as life from above. Others see in it the echo of something else, perhaps a technology long gone. In the ruins of Sippar, archaeologists uncovered clay tablets baked black from an ancient fire. Among them was the list of kings before the flood. It mentions 8 rulers who reigned for 241,200 years. Then came the waters. Afterward, a single name appears: Ubara Tutu of Shurupak, father of Zayasudra, the man who survived the deluge. Later copies add another line, faded but still visible under infrared scan. Kingship was taken up again from heaven for one last time. The story continues in later Sumerian hymns. A divine monarch descends from the sky after the flood. His reign is marked by rebuilding, by the rediscovery of old knowledge. He is called Ninurta in some accounts, Naram Sin in others, and in later Babylonian retellings, his figure blends into that of Marduk, the son of Enki, the Stormbringer, the god who sought to rule both heaven and earth. It is this last name, Marduk, that later priests of Babylon identify as the one who defied the old order of the gods. The tablets say Marduk built walls around his city higher than any before. He gathered craftsmen and scribes from Eridu, Ur, and Lagash. He restored the temple of Esagila, saying, "I will make my name endure when theirs are dust." But something changed. The sky darkened, the river levels fell. Cuneiform tablets from around 10,800 BCE, when converted through regnal lists and genealogies, speak of a fire from the firmament. One fragment reads, "The sun vanished, the stars moved like serpents, and the fields turned to glass." In modern geology, that glass is found. Layers of melted quartz and nanodiamonds appear across the Middle East, North America, and parts of Europe. They mark the same boundary as the soot and platinum, the global scar of a cosmic impact. A swarm of fragments, possibly from a comet that broke apart in Earth's upper atmosphere, may have struck in several places at once. To the ancient scribes, it was not a comet, it was judgment. After this event, the record of the Anunnaki begins to fade. Cities like Eridu and Uruk enter what modern historians call the shadow period. Their king lists fracture, their writing shifts from pictographs to abstract wedges. It is as if the survivors tried to preserve memory through code. The myths that follow of gods ascending, of floods, of kings turned to stars, seem to come from that silence. The fall of Marduk, or the last Anunnaki king, is never described as death. The tablets say simply, he departed in light. In 1899, when Robert Koldewey excavated the ruins of Babylon, he found beneath the foundations of Esagila a series of black stones engraved with geometric spirals and magnetic inlay. They were not local basalt, but a type of crystalline rock found only in regions of Anatolia. The inscriptions around them, written in an older dialect, repeat a single phrase: those who fell returned to the deep. The word for deep here, Abzu, was later used to describe the subterranean domain of Enki, the god of wisdom and water. The idea of the Abzu has long puzzled researchers. In older translations, it is rendered as a mythic underworld or ocean beneath the earth. But when Sumerologists like Samuel Noah Kramer compared the term with early Akkadian engineering texts, they noticed something else. It referred to reservoirs, channels, and controlled flows. In one tablet, the phrase Abzudur Anki appears, meaning the deep bond between heaven and earth. Some see it as metaphor. Others suspect it was literal, a forgotten network beneath the cities, perhaps a power source, perhaps a means of communication with the gods who departed. As centuries passed, this knowledge fragmented. In Egypt, echoes of it appear in the concept of the Duat, a hidden realm beneath the earth, where the sun travelled at night. In Greek lore, it became Hades. In Central America, Xibalba. All describe an underworld not of death, but of memory, where the old rulers still dwell. The fall of the last Anunnaki king, then, was not a single moment. It was a slow, vanishing one, mirrored in climate change, in the rise of new peoples, in the fading of once clear skies. Around 9,600 BCE, at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, vast pillars were erected. Each one faced a different star system as it appeared before the precession shift. The builders carved vultures, comets, and a dying sun. Scientists from the University of Edinburgh in 2017 compared the carvings with star maps and found alignment suggesting the monument was built to mark an impact event, possibly the same Younger Dryas catastrophe. If so, Göbekli Tepe may be a memorial, not to gods, but to those who fell from them. The Anunnaki, if they were once rulers, engineers, or something beyond, were remembered as divine because memory itself became myth. When knowledge breaks, stories are what survive. The king who fell, whether called Marduk, Enlil, or another name lost in erosion, left behind no body, no grave, only a silence recorded in clay. The final line of one damaged tablet reads, "When the sky returned, we built again, but the light had changed." The city that spoke in stone. In the southern reaches of Iraq, near the ancient marshlands where the Euphrates once met the sea, lies a mound of dust called Tel Abu Shahrain. Beneath it sleeps Eridu, the city that Sumerian texts call the first city on earth. Archaeologists discovered its remains in 1948, uncovering layer upon layer of construction, each resting on the ashes of another. The oldest level, level 18th, dates to about 5,400 BCE. But beneath even that, sonar readings in the 1,980 seconds revealed something else, patterns of denser stone, arranged in concentric formations older than the settlement above it. No artifacts were retrieved. The layers were left undisturbed. In the Sumerian king list, Eridu is where kingship descended from heaven. It was ruled first by Alulim, who reigned for 28,800 years, followed by Alangar, who ruled for 36,000. To the scribes who recorded these figures, time was not measured in solar years, but in something else, perhaps lunar cycles, perhaps symbolic. Yet even when reduced through astronomical calibration, their reigns still stretch back far before known civilization. The tablets say Alulim was chosen by Enki, the god of water and wisdom, who established his throne upon the Abzu. The Abzu appears again an underground domain, the same term that surfaced beneath Babylon in later eras. Excavations in Eridu uncovered a vast system of baked clay pipes and subterranean channels. Some lead nowhere. Others spiral downward in perfect curves, with a precision that modern engineers found difficult to explain for the era. The channels are too narrow for human passage and too complex for irrigation. Some believe they were part of an early water system. Others suggest they were symbolic representations of the god's domain. But there is a third possibility, one that researchers rarely publish in official reports, that these structures were remnants of something predating Sumer itself. When Sir Leonard Woolley, the British archaeologist known for uncovering the royal tombs of Ur, visited Eridu in the 1922, he described the site as a ruin older than myth, where legend walks in the dust. His notes, preserved at the British Museum, mention a series of fused stones found under Temple VI. They appeared as if melted from extreme heat, yet there were no signs of fire or ash. Samples sent to London showed traces of magnetite and silica glass. Today, such fusion occurs only at temperatures above 1,600 degrees Celsius conditions beyond ancient kiln technology. In the mythology of Eridu, Enki was said to hold the Mi, divine decrees, or tablets of civilization. These were described not as writings, but as physical objects that glowed and hummed when touched. One hymn to Enki lists the Mi as including truth, wisdom, law, crafts, the plough, the flood. The same word, Mi, is also used in later Akkadian as to measure. If the stories preserve even fragments of reality, they suggest that knowledge itself was once stored in objects, artifacts of stone or metal, not scrolls. In 2010, an excavation led by Dr. Abdul Karim al-Qureshi uncovered a cylindrical seal near the temple foundations, inscribed with a scene showing a man between two winged figures, facing what appears to be a star within a crescent. Around it are 7 dots, possibly representing planets. The carving style predates the known Sumerian cylinder seals by at least 1,000 years. The imagery resembles not agricultural or domestic scenes, but astronomy. When infrared imaging was applied, faint additional carvings appeared lines resembling coordinates. Al-Qureshi proposed that the seal could represent celestial mapping. His findings were quietly archived after the dig was closed for security reasons. The city itself, as reconstructed through its strata, shows repeated cycles of destruction and rebuilding. The lowest temples are small and simple, the later ones vast and precise. Each new era rebuilt directly over the last, preserving the same layout but refining the proportions. The foundations of Temple 16th align almost perfectly to true north off by less than 1 degree. Such alignment would not recur in Mesopotamian construction until the ziggurats of Ur, nearly 3 millennia later. This precision suggests an inheritance of forgotten geometry. Texts from Eridu, such as the instructions of Shurupak, survive in fragments. They speak of laws, conduct, and rituals, but also of the devices of the old time. One translation by Thorkild Jacobson reads, "Do not move the stones of the gods, for they are balanced with the breath." The phrase, stones of the gods, has led to debate. Some interpret it as sacred monuments. Others think it may refer to literal stones with unusual properties, perhaps magnetic or resonant. Nearby, archaeologists found a series of small basalt discs with holes drilled through their centers. When struck, they emit a clear, ringing tone. Their purpose remains unknown. Eridu's oldest layers contain no signs of warfare. There are no fortifications, no weapons, only altars and vessels. But in later strata, weapons appear suddenly: bronze fragments, burned walls, and human remains. The shift is abrupt, as if peace ended overnight. Around this same time, the surrounding region dried. The sea retreated from the marshlands. Sediment cores show a rapid salinization event, possibly from a tectonic shift or a massive storm surge. In mythology, Enki's temple is said to have been swallowed by the sea's anger. The transition between the peaceful and the violent layers mirrors what scholars call the Uruk expansion, when the first true cities spread northward. But Eridu, the mother of them all, was already fading. Its final temples were abandoned. Sand drifted in, covering the walls. A later Babylonian text laments, "The city of Enki, where the first waters flowed, lies silent. The gods have withdrawn." In 1964, satellite imaging during the Corona spy program captured the first aerial views of the Eridu region. Beneath the dunes, faint circular patterns appeared, rings within rings. Some matched the subterranean features recorded decades earlier. The shapes resembled not streets, but waveforms. When these patterns were digitally overlaid with the temple's layout, they formed a harmonic grid. The spacing between lines corresponded roughly to 432 Hz, a frequency later associated with resonance and tuning systems. While coincidence cannot be ruled out, the numbers recur too neatly to ignore. If Eridu was the first city, it may also have been a transmitter. Its structures of stone and clay, its underground channels, and its precisely aligned temples suggest a purpose beyond habitation. The ancients called it the mouth of the gods. Perhaps they meant it literally a place where the earth spoke back to the sky. The myths that survive paint Eridu not as a city of men, but of intermediaries. Sages known as the Apkallu, half-human, half-divine, were said to rise from the Abzu carrying tablets of wisdom. Each taught a different art: writing, mathematics, building, healing, and metallurgy. The last of them, Adapa, defied the god Anu and was cast down. His story mirrors that of Prometheus in Greece and Enoch in Hebrew, texts a being who bridges heaven and earth, punished for sharing knowledge. When Eridu finally vanished beneath silt, the Apkallu became memories, the Mi became myths, and the geometry became ruin. Yet the silence they left behind still hums faintly through what remains of its stones. Beneath each layer of dust, something waits balanced, as the text said, with the breath. The flood that carried kings. The flood story does not begin in Genesis, nor even in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Its earliest form comes from a damaged clay tablet found in the ruins of Nippur, written in Sumerian more than 4,000 years before the Hebrew text was ever set down. The tablet names a man called Ziusudra, he of long life. It says he was king of Shuruppak when the gods decided to erase mankind. The hearts of the great ones moved to destroy, the text reads. Only Enki, the god of water and wisdom, warned him. He spoke through the walls of Ziusudra's house, saying, "Wall, hear me. Read wall, pay attention. The flood will sweep through. Build a great boat." For centuries, scholars treated this as myth. Yet when geologists began mapping the Persian Gulf basin in the 20th century, they found layers of sediment, 12 meters deep, evidence of a flood that had once drowned the plains of southern Mesopotamia. Radiocarbon dating places it near 10,800 BCE, aligning almost exactly with the end of the Younger Dryas period, when glacial meltwater poured into the oceans at catastrophic speed. The Mesopotamian flood was not a single event, but a convergence. Melting ice sheets released torrents into the Tigris and Euphrates. At the same time, evidence of a massive impact, possibly from a fragmented comet, points to sudden atmospheric disturbance. Nanodiamonds, soot, and iridium markers of cosmic debris have been found across Syria, Turkey, and Iran, embedded in the same layer that records the flood. To the ancient people who survived it, it was not ice melt. It was judgment descending from the sky. Zisudra's story continues. The tablet says, "He opened a window of the great boat, saw light, and fell to his knees. When the waters receded, he built an altar. Then kingship descended again from heaven." This phrase appears across every version of the story, unchanged. In the Akkadian and Babylonian retellings, Ziusudra becomes Atrahasis, and later Utnapishtim, the man whom the gods granted immortality. But behind the changing names, the pattern is clear. A pre-flood world destroyed, followed by a divine restoration led by a single surviving king. In 1931, archaeologist Leonard Woolley uncovered a layer of pure mud at Ur. Beneath it, the remains of an older settlement. Above it, a new civilization. The layer was 2.5 meters thick. It was not a river flood, Woolley wrote, but a deluge that swept across the entire land. He found clay figurines buried within the silt one, bearing an inscription that reads, "Servant of Enki." The flood, it seems, erased not only cities but memory itself. The myths describe what happened next. When the waters retreated, the gods divided the world. Enlil, the storm god, took the northern lands. Enki, lord of the Abzu, remained in the south. And over both they placed a single ruler, a hybrid being called the Bright One, sometimes rendered as Ninurta, sometimes as Marduk. Later texts describe him as the last to wear the crown of the sky, the same phrase that would appear thousands of years later in Babylonian hymns to Marduk, king of the Anunnaki, who judged the earth. If these accounts preserve history in symbolic form, they may describe the survival of a civilization that existed before the flood. The tablets say that before the deluge, the me, the laws and technologies of the gods, were kept in Eridu. When the flood came, they were carried in the boat of Ziusudra. In one fragment, now in the Istanbul Museum, the list of rescued items includes the tablet of stars, the vessel of measures, the seed of life. To modern eyes, these read like mythic metaphors, but to a people rebuilding after catastrophe, they may have represented real instruments, records of astronomy, tools for engineering, samples for replanting. In 2014, sediment analysis near the ancient river delta of Shurapak revealed a thin layer rich in titanium dioxide and carbon spherules, materials formed by high heat. Above it lay crushed marine shells mixed with freshwater debris. The pattern suggests that a massive surge from the Persian Gulf followed an atmospheric explosion, pushing seawater hundreds of kilometers inland. Such an event could have been triggered by an airburst similar to the Tunguska blast of 1908, but far larger. To ancient eyes, it would have seemed as though the sea itself rose into the sky. The cultural memory of that event spread far beyond Mesopotamia. The Greeks told of Deucalion, the Hindus of Manu, the Maya of the hero Hunahpu, who survived the waters. Even in North America, Hopi traditions speak of the fourth world, destroyed by flood. Each story names a survivor, a teacher, and a set of preserved seeds or tablets. The parallels are too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. They point toward a shared ancestral memory, carried through migration and myth, of a real cataclysm around 13,000 years ago. In the Sumerian version, the flood was not simply punishment, it was a cleansing of corruption between the gods themselves. One tablet from Nippur describes a council of Anunnaki arguing over the fate of mankind. Enlil demands destruction. Enki objects, saying, "The handiwork of our hands must not be erased." When the flood ends, Enlil is appeased, and kingship is lowered once more from heaven. This pattern destruction followed by restoration may reflect a cycle of collapse and rebirth in human civilization itself. Archaeological layers across the Near East show an abrupt cultural break between 10,800 and 9,600 BCE. Settlements vanish, pottery styles disappear. Then, suddenly, new technologies emerge: domestication, irrigation, astronomical alignment. Göbekli Tepe, built around 9,500 BCE, rises from this silence. Its builders, though officially labelled hunter-gatherers, carved limestone pillars weighing over 10 tons, decorated with precise reliefs. One of these, known as the Vulture Stone, appears to encode a date, the position of the constellation Sagittarius as it appeared around 10,800 BCE, the same moment as the flood. If the Anunnaki were ever real rulers, be they divine, human, or hybrid, the flood may have been the boundary that separated their age from ours. The Sumerians said that before the flood, kingship belonged to the gods. Afterward, it passed to men. The fall of the last Anunnaki king, then, might not have been a battle or death, but a withdrawal, a deliberate ending of contact between two worlds. When the waters receded, survivors built new cities upon the ruins. They carried fragments of the old world, but no longer understood their origin. The flood had washed away not only stone, but meaning. Yet in every myth, a single line remains constant: those who remembered built again. The sky that fell to earth. Long before astronomy was a science, the sky was memory. To the ancient scribes of Mesopotamia, each star had a name, each movement a meaning. They did not see the heavens as separate from earth, but as its mirror, an upper kingdom reflecting the lower. When light streaked across the night sky, they wrote that the gods made war among themselves. When fire descended, they said, the heavens fell. For centuries these were only words. Then, in the late 20th century, scientists began uncovering geological scars that seemed to match the stories. The Younger Dryas boundary, dated to around 10,800 BCE, holds microscopic spheres of molten metal, soot, and nanodiamonds. These materials form under intense heat, beyond the range of volcanic eruptions. They are found across continents from the Syrian desert to the Great Lakes of North America. The pattern suggests multiple impacts, or a swarm of fragments entering the atmosphere in a chain. The Earth, it seems, was struck not once but many times within days or weeks. The event's origin remains uncertain. Some researchers point to the Taurid meteor stream, a vast belt of debris left behind by a disintegrated comet thousands of years ago. The same stream still crosses Earth's orbit twice each year, producing the Taurid meteor showers every October and November. Embedded within it are larger bodies some over a kilometre wide. If one or more of these struck the planet during the late Pleistocene, the effects would have been catastrophic. Ancient cultures appear to have remembered. In Mesopotamian myth, the god Ninurta wields a weapon called Shara, described as a voice that speaks from afar, flashing like the sun. In later Babylonian texts, this weapon becomes Marduk's thunderbolt, an object that shakes the mountains, burns the seas, and splits the sky. Such imagery may not describe divine war, but a celestial strike witnessed by early humans. The Sumerians lacked the language of physics, so they used the language of gods. Similar records appear in Egypt. The Book of the Heavenly Cow tells of Ra sending his eye, depicted as a flaming disk, to punish mankind, after which the fields were drenched in fire. In South America, the Muisca myth of Bochica speaks of a sky that burst open with flame. In the American Southwest, Hopi rock art shows concentric circles with tails, often interpreted as comets. Each culture, separated by oceans, carries the same image, something descending from the heavens, bringing light and ruin. The traces remain in stone. In 2017, researchers from the University of Edinburgh analysed carvings at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, particularly the pillar known as Vulture Stone, or Pillar 43. The relief shows a vulture holding a sphere a scorpion beneath, and a row of smaller animals aligned with star positions. Using astronomical software, the team matched the arrangement to the night sky, as seen in 10,950 BCE. The alignment marks the approximate date of the Younger Dryas, onset the same period when massive fires swept across continents. To those who carved the stone, the event was not just destruction, it was a message. The imagery may depict constellations warning of when the cometary debris would return. The vulture symbol of death and renewal holds the sphere as if to say the sky once fell and could fall again. In Mesopotamian tablets, the word Anu means both sky and God. The Anunnaki are the offspring of Anu, those who came from the heavens. To later generations, they became mythic beings. But if their memory arose from a real cosmic encounter, the coming of the Anunnaki may once have meant the descent of something literal, stones, light, or fire from the sky. The texts say the Anunnaki judged mankind, their judgment described as burning wind. One Akkadian cylinder seal even shows a robed figure standing before a winged disk, rays extending downward. Some interpret it as a god arriving from above. Others now see it differently, perhaps a record of the day the heavens struck the earth. In Greenland's ice cores, the story is written again. Layers dated to 10,800 BCE show a spike in soot and platinum, followed by centuries of cold. The fires darkened the sky, sunlight dimmed, temperatures fell. Forests burned from California to Syria. Mammoths, giant sloths, and saber-toothed cats vanished within generations. Human settlements collapsed, reduced to isolated bands. It was the beginning of what scientists now call the Younger Dryas cold interval, a 1,000-year winter triggered by disaster. For the survivors, it must have felt like divine punishment. Across myths, gods withdraw after the catastrophe. Enki retreats to the Abzu. Marduk rises to the heavens. The phrase, "the gods departed," appears in tablets from both Sumer and Akkad. The Egyptian texts echo it. The divine ones sailed north to the sky. The Maya record the same motif. Those of light returned to the stars. It is possible the survivors saw not divine ascent, but celestial disappearance, the lights in the sky fading behind smoke and dust. One lesser-known Babylonian tablet from Sippar describes the day when the sky burned and the rivers turned to steam. It says the king gathered his priests and sealed the wisdom of the old ones inside the walls of the temple before fleeing north. That temple, Esagila, would later be rebuilt by Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century BCE. Beneath its later floors, Koldui's excavation found vitrified stones rocks fused together by heat. Whether by fire, lightning, or something else, the foundation had melted. By 9,600 BCE, the earth began to warm again. The ice receded. Oceans rose, flooding coastal plains. The survivors moved inland, carrying fragments of the old world. They built monuments aligned with the same stars that had once burned them. Perhaps it was remembrance, perhaps warning. When Plato wrote of Atlantis in the 4th century BCE, he dated its destruction to 9,000 years before Solon, around 9,600 BCE. The same threshold that ended the Younger Dryas. He described a sudden flood and fire from the sky. Modern scholars call it coincidence. Yet the timing repeats with precision across myths from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Americas. If the last Anunnaki king truly ruled before this catastrophe, then his fall was not political, it was planetary. The war of the gods may have been nature's own reckoning, the sky itself turning against its children. Afterward, the world changed. The stars looked the same, but they were no longer trusted. One fragment of the Atrahasis epic ends with a line rarely translated. The heavens are not as before, their path is broken. It may describe a comet trail, a shift in the stars, or simply the feeling of loss. Whatever it was, the ancients looked upward and saw a wound in the sky. From that silence, civilization began again. The return of the builders. When the dust settled and the ice began to melt, the world was new again. Forests reclaimed plains where cities had been. Rivers carved fresh courses through the rubble of vanished lands. Across what is now Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, small groups of survivors began to gather near springs and sheltered valleys. They built circles of stone not for shelter, but for memory. It was the beginning of what archaeologists now call the pre-pottery Neolithic, around 9600 BCE. In the archaeological record, it looks like the sudden invention of architecture. In the myths, it is described differently, as the return of the gods. The first of these sites, Göbekli Tepe, stood on a hill in southeastern Anatolia. Beneath layers of backfilled soil, excavators uncovered more than 20 circular enclosures, each formed from towering T-shaped pillars weighing up to 20 tons. The stones were carved with foxes, vultures, lions, and serpents animals that had vanished from the region by the time the site was rediscovered in the 1990s. No domestic houses surrounded the complex. There were no graves, no signs of agriculture, and yet the builders shaped and lifted megaliths with a precision unknown to later Neolithic villages. The site dates to around 9500 BCE, the same threshold that ended the Younger Dryas. Its builders were hunter-gatherers, at least by the tools they left behind, but the scale of the architecture suggests knowledge of geometry, organization, and planning. Each pillar faces a specific point on the horizon. When mapped, their orientations trace the rising of certain stars, Deneb, Sirius, and Vega, over a span of centuries. The builders were tracking the sky, not for survival, but for remembrance. The Sumerians, writing millennia later, remembered their ancestors as the ones who built for the stars. They called them the Anunnaki. In their hymns, these beings raised temples where heaven met earth. If the oral memory carried from the survivors of the cataclysm, Göbekli Tepe may have been the first attempt to rebuild what the flood destroyed, a place to reconnect heaven and earth. 1,000 kilometers to the south, in the Jordan Valley, another site appeared around the same time, Jericho. Beneath its later Bronze Age walls lies a circular tower built from limestone blocks, 12 meters high. A staircase winds up its interior. At the time of its construction, there were no cities, no pottery, no metal. The tower's base aligns precisely with the setting sun at the summer solstice. To modernize, it is an early fortification. To its builders, perhaps a monument marking the return of light after years of darkness. Further west, in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, lies Baalbek, later known to the Romans as Heliopolis, the city of the Sunday. Under its classical ruins rests a far older platform made of 3 massive stones, each weighing more than 800 tons. No Bronze Age tools could have lifted them, yet they are fitted with exact precision. Geologists examining the quarry marks found that the lower layers show weathering inconsistent with the Roman era. Some blocks may have been in place long before history's first empires rose. Local legend calls them Stones of the Watchers, echoing the Mesopotamian term for the Anunnaki as Igigi, the Watchers of Heaven. Quote, in Egypt, the pattern continued. Before the dynasties, before the pharaohs, there was Nabta-Playa, a megalithic circle in the Nubian desert, aligned to the rising of Orion's belt around 4800 BCE. Its orientation preserves the memory of a sky older still, when those stars rose due south, as they had in 10,500 BCE. The builders, perhaps nomads of the Sahara, before it dried, carried a star map that predated their own time by thousands of years. The same configuration would later appear on the Giza Plateau, where the 3 great pyramids mirror Orion's belt once more. To the Egyptians, These builders were not human ancestors but divine architects, the followers of Horus, beings who came before the first time. In Sumer, they were remembered as the Apkallu. In Mesoamerica, as the civilizers from the sea. Each culture tells the same story. After the flood, beings of knowledge appeared, taught stone, working, measurement, and the reading of the heavens, then vanished again. Whether they were remnants of an earlier civilization or symbols of human memory itself, their presence marks a sudden leap in skill across the globe. Archaeological evidence suggests that megalithic construction appeared simultaneously in distant regions Anatolia, Egypt, Peru, Japan, and the British Isles, without clear cultural contact. This synchronicity may indicate not diffusion, but recollection. Scattered groups, each reviving fragments of a lost pattern learned before the cataclysm. The shared traits, astronomical alignment, cyclopean scale, and ritual precision suggest a unified idea carried by survivors across continents. One recurring number connects these sites, 432. The spacing of stones at Göbekli Tepe, the height of Jericho's tower in inches, the resonance frequency of Baalbek's foundation blocks when tested by modern instruments, all approximate multiples of 432. In later Hindu cosmology, a full cycle of the world, or Maha Yuga, lasts 4,320,000 years. The same number appears in Norse and Babylonian myths. Scholars dismiss it as coincidence, but ancient architects may have encoded it as a harmonic constant, a remembrance of balance between earth and sky. The Anunnaki's fall, according to Mesopotamian records, left humankind to rebuild in their image, but not of their power. The return of the builders may represent the first generation born after the flood, carrying fragments of the old world's design, yet lacking its means of creation. They could shape stone, but not the forces that once moved it. Myths of levitating stones and sound-borne construction might preserve dim recollections of technologies lost in the fire. In the temple hymns of Eridu, Enki is praised as the one who sets foundations in the deep and raises walls to the stars. The same phrase, nearly identical, appears in inscriptions at later sites across the Near East. It may have been more than poetry. It could reflect a shared blueprint, a template passed down from pre-flood times. The geometry of these temples forms the same ratios seen in orbital mechanics and musical harmony. The builders, conscious or not, were encoding the cosmos into Earth. By 8000 BCE, as agriculture took hold, the great circles fell silent. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Jericho's tower was filled with rubble. The ancient stones of Baalbek were left exposed to centuries of wind. The new world no longer needed to remember the old. Yet through their silence, the monuments endure, still aligned to the same stars, still tracing the rhythm of a forgotten sky. The hidden map beneath the sands. When sea levels rose after the Younger Dryas, the shape of the world changed. Coastlines drowned. River mouths became bays. Valleys turned into gulfs. Between 10,000 and 8,000 BCE, more than 20 million square kilometers of land vanished under water territory that once connected continents. To the survivors of that age, it must have seemed as though the gods had folded the edges of the earth and hidden the old world beneath the sea. In ancient myths, that memory remained. The drowned kingdoms, the lost plains, the cities swallowed by sand. Modern science confirms what the myths describe. Sonar mapping of the continental shelves reveals drowned river systems now hundreds of meters below the surface. The Persian Gulf once formed a vast fertile valley home to lakes, herds, and human settlements before it filled with water around 8000 BCE. This basin, often called the Gulf Oasis, could have been the true cradle of early Mesopotamian civilization. To the Sumerians, it was the land of Dilmun, described in their tablets as a pure place, bright and eternal, located where the sun rises. The name reappears in the Epic of Gilgamesh as the distant home of Utnapishtim, the immortal survivor of the flood. If Dilmun once stood at the edge of this drowned valley, its memory might be the echo of a real homeland lost to rising seas. Satellite imagery of the Gulf floor shows faint grid-like patterns, possible remnants of ancient channels and structures buried under silt. No official excavation has been attempted. The waters are politically contested. Yet the contours of the seabed match descriptions from Sumerian texts: 3 rivers converging, one sweet as milk, another bitter as salt, and a third flowing with copper. These could correspond to freshwater springs, seawater intrusion, and mineral deposits, all known features of the submerged landscape. Further west, in the Sahara, the desert hides its own memory. Beneath dunes, near the Gilf Kebir Plateau in Egypt, radar scans from NASA's Shuttle Radar Topography mission revealed circular depressions and buried channels stretching hundreds of kilometers. One of these formations, called the Richat Structure, or Eye of the Sahara, measures 40 kilometers across. Officially described as a collapsed dome of sedimentary rock, its concentric rings mirror Plato's description of Atlantis, alternating bands of land and sea encircled by mountains to the north. Its age, uncertain, may extend beyond 10,000 BCE. Whether coincidence or memory, the resemblance has drawn attention for decades. Old maps hint that something once existed where no land should be. The Piri race map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, depicts the coast of Antarctica centuries before its official discovery. Its outline matches the continent's subglacial profile, as revealed by modern radar, an ice-free shoreline that last existed more than 6,000 years ago. Piri Reis claimed his chart was compiled from maps of the ancients. Some fragments may have originated from Alexandria's lost library, or earlier sources still. If accurate, they imply a cartographic inheritance from a time when global coastlines were different, when the world still remembered its earlier form. Ancient Egyptian records may preserve pieces of that map. The Turin Papyrus, a fragmented text from the 13th century BCE, lists dynasties that ruled Egypt before the kings of men. Among them are beings called the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, said to have ruled for 13,420 years before the first dynasty. The same number appears, almost unchanged, in Sumerian lists describing pre-flood kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years. These enormous spans may reflect cycles of the sky, the precession of the equinoxes, a slow 25,920-year drift of the heavens that ancient astronomers somehow tracked. Half of that cycle, about 13,000 years, marks the interval between the fall of the Anunnaki king and the present age. Underneath modern deserts lie traces of rivers that once fed green valleys. Infrared imaging over the eastern Sahara reveals the bed of a massive waterway, Wadi Tushka, connecting to the Nile before 8000 BCE. At its terminus, near the modern border of Sudan, lie buried mounds arranged in geometric clusters. They align roughly to the constellation Orion, as it appeared 12,000 years ago. Archaeologists have not excavated them. The area remains remote and covered by shifting sand. But their symmetry resembles early temple foundations found in Mesopotamia. It suggests a shared architectural memory stretching across continents. In India's Gulf of Khambhat, sonar surveys in 2001 detected rectilinear structures 40 meters below the surface. Samples dated between 9,500 and 9,000 BCE, long before the Indus Valley civilization. Among the artifacts were fragments of pottery, charred wood, and fossilized bone. The site lies near where the Sarasvati River once flowed, a watercourse celebrated in the Rig Veda as the cradle of knowledge. The discovery was controversial. Sedimentation made excavation difficult. Yet if genuine, it indicates urban activity at the same time Göbekli Tepe stood above Anatolia. Such parallels suggest that after the Great Flood, survivors sought high ground while their coastal cities sank. The memories of those cities endured as myths. Dilmun, Atlantis, Aztlan, Lemuria names whispered across ages, pointing to the same lost horizon. Each tradition describes not only destruction, but concealment, the idea that sacred knowledge was hidden beneath the sands or under the sea. In Babylonian legend, the god Oannes rose from the waters each dawn to teach humanity, then returned beneath the waves by night. His domain, they said, lay in the deep of wisdom, perhaps the same drowned valleys that once held the earliest temples. By the Bronze Age, desert winds had covered the last visible ruins. Caravan routes passed over them without awareness. Yet maps drawn by Greek, Arabic, and Renaissance scholars still traced coastlines and islands no longer visible. They were copying something older charts, inherited from an age before erasure. When modern researchers overlay these ancient maps on post-glacial topography, a pattern emerges. Many mark the now submerged continental shelves, the very lands lost between 10,000 and 8,000 BCE. It is as if humanity once knew the world's true outline and then forgot. The Sumerian word for map, Giskur, also means plan of the mountain or design of the world. To draw such a thing required more than observation, it required memory. The hidden map beneath the sands is not a single artifact, but a network of echoes, submerged valleys, forgotten coastlines, recurring numbers, and names that drift between myth and geology. They hint that the fall of the last Anunnaki king was not only the loss of a ruler, but the folding away of an entire geography, a rearrangement of the earth itself. When the waters rose, history's first pages were sealed beneath them, waiting in the dark. The kingdoms of dust and light. When the seas calmed and the sky cleared, the survivors emerged into a world that no longer recognized them. The rivers had shifted their beds, the stars rose in new position, the voices of the old gods had gone silent. Yet beneath the confusion, people remembered faintly the order that once bound heaven and earth. From that memory, they built the first kingdoms. The clay tablets say kingship was lowered again from heaven, but this time it did not descend to the Anunnaki, it came to men. The earliest of these cities was Eridu, reborn upon its ancient mound. The king list begins there, naming Alulim as the first ruler after the flood. He reigned 28,800 years. The tablet reads, an impossible number that scholars now read as symbol. Yet the meaning may not be duration, but distance, the measure of separation between gods and men. Alulim's reign marks the point where myth and archaeology begin to overlap. At Eridu's lower levels, bricks bear reed impressions unlike any later construction, and the walls are laid in a spiral pattern, a form repeated in later temples as a symbol of the path of descent. The same spiral appears in Egypt, carved into the oldest walls at Abydos and painted on the ceilings of predynastic tombs. Egypt's first kings, like those of Sumer, traced their authority to a divine origin. Narmer, the unifier of Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BCE, bore a title written with a falcon, Horus the striker, and a phrase meaning, he who returns order. His palette, carved in grey siltstone, shows a serpent emerging from the waters and a falcon grasping a captive. Scholars interpret it as a political symbol, but the imagery mirrors older Mesopotamian myths, in which the sky god subdues the serpent of chaos to establish the first kingdom. Before Narmer, Egyptian texts mention Menes, a semi-mythic predecessor whose name means the established one. The Turin Papyrus lists rulers before him, the Shemsu Hor, or followers of Horus, said to have reigned for 13,400 420 years. These beings, described as radiant ones who ruled in the age of the gods, are strikingly similar to the pre-flood kings of Sumer who ruled before the deluge swept over. Both traditions begin anew after catastrophe, both speak of divine instruction, and both credit their founders with rebuilding civilization from dust. The Egyptians called their first age Zep Tepi, the first time, when the gods lived on earth among men. Its imagery depicts the same world described in Mesopotamia before the flood: fertile plains, towers of stone, a luminous order sustained by the sky. The priests of Heliopolis said Zep Tepi ended when the eye withdrew, the sun dimmed, the gods departed, the land was left to the children of men. What followed was the age of dust, the time when kings learned to rule without divine presence, guided only by memory. In Mesopotamia, the shift from divine to mortal rule is recorded in a single line of cuneiform. After the flood had swept over, kingship was lowered from heaven a second time to Kish. Kish was not near the sea like Eridu. It stood inland, on higher ground, safe from the floodplain. Its rulers called themselves shepherds of the people, adopting titles that once belonged to the gods. The first known name is Etana, described as the one who ascended to heaven. A fragment of his legend survives, a story of a man carried by an eagle through the clouds to ask the gods for the plant of birth. Some see in this the mythic transformation of the last surviving Anunnaki, the ascent of one who once walked among them. From Kish, the pattern of rule spread outward: Uruk, Lagash, Each city claimed its patron god had once ruled in person. Inscriptions describe processions where statues of these gods were carried through the streets, representing the return of the divine. The rituals mirrored cosmic order, each city reenacting the moment when heaven met earth. Yet in the texts, the gods no longer spoke. They dwelt in their temples, silent. The priests, wearing robes patterned with stars, became their intermediaries. Power shifted from those who built cities to those who interpreted their meaning. This transformation from divine kings to priest kings is the core of early civilization. The rulers of Sumer called themselves Lugal, great man, but their crowns and staffs echoed older symbols of celestial authority. The rod and ring, seen in Sumerian art, passed from god to king, represented measurement and law, the same tools once attributed to Enki. Through ritual, the priests preserved fragments of that knowledge: astronomy, geometry, irrigation, and metallurgy. The temples became observatories, their terraces aligned to solstices, their courtyards reflecting the heavens in pools of still water. In Egypt, the pattern was similar. The earliest pyramids were not tombs, but stairways, artificial mountains built to reconnect with the divine realm. The step pyramid of Djoser, designed by the architect Imhotep around 2650 BCE, stands above a labyrinth of chambers cut deep into bedrock. Its design echoes older Mesopotamian ziggurats, which were called Ekur, mountain house. Both structures symbolize the axis between worlds. Beneath them lay chambers of stone, above them points aligned to the stars. They were the new bridges, built not by gods, but by men who remembered them. Even in their inscriptions, both cultures preserved the same phrases: "May the king ascend to the sky. May he join the company of the shining ones." These were not metaphors of afterlife, but echoes of an older event, the departure of the Anunnaki. Each royal burial, each ascension rite, repeated the story of the lost connection. The kings were trying to retrace the path upward. The blending of divine and mortal rule created something new: the idea of sacred kingship. In Sumer, this gave rise to law. The Code of Ur-Nammu and later Hammurabi claimed to be the word of the gods brought through the king. In Egypt, it became ritual, the daily ceremony of reviving the sun, reenacted to sustain balance, or ma'at. Both traditions sought to stabilize a world still haunted by the memory of collapse. By 3000 BCE, the Pasanav Empire had spread across the Fertile Crescent. Stone replaced clay, writing hardened from symbols into law. Yet beneath the order lay an older grief, the loss of direct contact with the divine. The priests wrote that the gods had gone to their distant abode. The stars, once seen as the thrones of living beings, became mere lights. The age of dust had settled, but within its monuments still flickered the geometry of light, the ratio, alignment, and design inherited from the builders who came before. The kings of this new world ruled not by voice, but by memory. Every temple, every ritual was an attempt to reassemble what the flood had undone. Civilization was not invention, it was recollection. And through that recollection, humanity became its own kind of God-fashioning order out of ruin, light out of dust. The tablets of the deep, in the heart of Mesopotamia, beneath layers of clay and centuries of rebuilding, lie the traces of what ancient scribes called Nisaba Duga, the wisdom tablets. They were said to have been written before the flood and sealed within temples, so that the knowledge of the gods would not vanish. The later Babylonians called them Sipar Shatamu, the archives of the deep. To this day, no one has found them, but their memory runs through every age, whispered in the same language of preservation and silence. The earliest reference comes from a tablet found at Nineveh, dating to the reign of Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE. The king, famous for his vast library, wrote that he read the writings of before the flood and understood the words of the stone boxes. The phrase puzzled scholars. The flood he mentions refers to the event that separated myth from history, the Younger Dryas deluge, remembered as divine punishment. If Ashurbanipal truly reads something from before that time, he must have inherited copies of much older texts, themselves already ancient when Sumer rose. Archaeologists found more than 20,000 clay tablets in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library. Most are administrative records, hymns, and omens. Yet among them are fragments that speak of an earlier record, written on lapis and gold. These were said to have been hidden in the foundation of Ekkur, the mountain house of Enlil. The Ekkur temple once stood at Nippur, one of the oldest religious centers in Mesopotamia. Beneath its ziggurat, excavators found buried chambers lined with bitumen and stone. The contents had been looted long before, but fragments of baked clay remained, some vitrified, as if from extreme heat. The walls bore cuneiform markings, scorched into glassy surfaces. According to the Sumerian Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, writing itself was invented to preserve messages across the mountains after speech became confused. The tale implies that the first use of script was not commerce, but remembrance. Enmerkar, a descendant of the gods, is said to have copied the decrees of heaven onto clay. The same story appears in Egyptian lore, where the god Thoth records the words of Ra on plates of turquoise, hidden within the House of Life. Both cultures speak of a store of knowledge placed beyond reach, awaiting rediscovery. Later traditions called these records the Tablets of Destiny. In Babylonian myth, they granted authority over heaven and earth. Whoever possessed them spoke with the voice of Anu. They were stolen, lost, and recovered repeatedly in the myths, perhaps a reflection of real cycles of knowledge gained and forgotten. In the Enuma Elish, the Tablets of Destiny are seized by the dragon Tiamat's champion Kingu, then taken by Marduk after his victory. Marduk binds them to his breast, proclaiming order over chaos. The act is symbolic, writing itself as the taming of nature, the restoration of the divine pattern after the flood. Yet the oldest descriptions are different. A fragment from Sippar mentions black tablets that sing when struck. Another, found at Uruk, describes engraved stone that glows when the sun touches it. these are not metaphors familiar to cuneiform literature. Some researchers have suggested they may describe magnetic or piezoelectric effects materials that hum or emit faint light under pressure. If true, they might represent relics of a technology no longer understood by the scribes who inherited them. The Egyptians told a similar story. In the temple of Edfu, inscriptions speak of the divine words written by the ancestors, hidden in the island of the egg, when the world was flooded. The priests claimed these writings had been carved by the builder gods during Zep Tepi the first time. After the flood, they were recovered by Thoth and stored in the House of Life at Heliopolis. Copies, they said, were placed under every major temple to preserve the design of the universe. Archaeological surveys beneath Egyptian temples have revealed substructures, sealed chambers, sometimes filled with sand or stone boxes too heavy to move. Most remain unopened. In Greek accounts, the idea resurfaces as the legend of the Pillars of Hermes. According to Clement of Alexandria, the Egyptians claimed that Hermes Trismegistus inscribed all wisdom on 2 pillars, one of brick, one of stone, so that one would survive fire and the other flood. Later, Josephus wrote that the descendants of Seth engraved astronomical knowledge on pillars before the deluge, which remain to this day in the land of Syriad. The location of Syriad, often identified with Egypt, connects the Greek and Mesopotamian versions the same pattern of divine records hidden against destruction. Even in later mystical texts, echoes persist. The Hebrew Sefer Raziel Hamalak describes a book of secrets given to Adam by angels after the fall. The Gnostic Apocryphon of John speaks of luminous tablets hidden within the deep. The Islamic Kitab al-Kitab calls the primordial record al-Law al-Mahfuz, the preserved tablet, containing the blueprint of creation. Across religions and centuries, the same image remains. A written record of divine order stored beyond reach, sometimes in the heavens, sometimes below the earth. Modern archaeologists, searching beneath ancient sites, have occasionally found sealed vaults matching these descriptions. In 1934, during excavations at Baghdad, workers uncovered a series of stone boxes filled with clay cylinders and metallic residues. Their purpose was never explained. The artifacts disappeared during later conflicts. In 1998, seismic imaging beneath the Sphinx in Egypt revealed a rectangular void roughly 9 meters deep directly under the forepaws. Some believe it could be the Hall of Records described by Plato's student Crantor and repeated in later Hermetic texts. Officially, the chamber remains unexplored. What unites all these legends is the conviction that the knowledge of the old world was not lost, but buried, sealed in places that mirror the underworld of myth. The Sumerians called it the Abzu, the deep waters beneath the earth. The Egyptians called it the Duat, the Greeks called it Hades. Each represents both a physical and metaphysical realm of preservation. To enter it was to retrieve memory itself. If the Anunnaki once ruled an age before the flood, the tablets of the deep may be the remnants of their archive, the encoded record of how the heavens and earth were once aligned. Whether they were literal objects or symbols of forgotten science, their shadow stretches through every library and legend that followed. The Library of Alexandria, the Hermetic texts, even the alchemists' pursuit of the prima materia, all may trace their origin to that single idea, that knowledge older than history lies waiting in darkness. The last line of a late Babylonian fragment preserved in the British Museum reads, "When the kings forgot the words of stone, the rivers rose again. The scribes left no interpretation. Perhaps they meant that forgetting has its own tide, that every time knowledge is lost, the flood returns in another form." The fall of the heavenly gate. In the time when memory still spoke through stone, the people of the plains gathered to build a tower. The tablets say they called the place Bab-Ilu, Gate of the Gods. It stood upon the ruins of older foundations, near the river junction that once held Eridu and later Babylon. The plan, according to later tradition, was to reach the heavens again to reclaim the link severed since the flood. The story would be remembered in Scripture as the Tower of Babel, but its roots lie deeper, in the slow unravelling of a world that once spoke one language and thought itself united under a single sky. The Sumerians believed language was not invention, but inheritance. The Me, the divine decrees of civilization, were said to contain words that carried power. When spoken correctly, they shaped reality. The gods of Eridu were keepers of this speech. Enki, Lord of Wisdom, held the tongue of the deep. His priests guarded the secret forms of names, the sounds that gave life to clay. To lose that language meant to lose command over nature itself. In the earliest cuneiform texts, language appears already fragmented. By the 3rd millennium BCE, Sumerian, Akkadian, and Elamite were spoken side by side. The scribes of Nippur kept parallel glossaries to translate one into another. They wrote laments about this confusion. The tongues of men are strange. No one knows his brother's speech. The same idea later became myth in Genesis humanity punished with many tongues after trying to ascend once more. But if the story preserves an older truth, it may describe the final collapse of a shared symbolic system, a language born before the flood, now breaking apart into human words. Archaeologically, the Tower of Babel may have been the ziggurat of Anunnaki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Its remains he beneath modern Baghdad, a core of mud brick once rising over 90 meters. It was rebuilt repeatedly, each dynasty trying to restore what earlier floods or wars had destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar II's inscription calls it a stairway between earth and the sky. The same phrase appears in much older Sumerian hymns describing the link between the gods and men. The ziggurat was not merely an observatory or temple, it was a reconstruction of the cosmic axis, the vertical bridge lost when the Anunnaki withdrew. In the Babylonian Enuma Elish, the gods create humankind to bear the labour of the heavens, but later regret their decision. The division of language may reflect the final withdrawal of divine communication, the moment when the priestly class, inheritors of the Me, could no longer read the old symbols. Across Mesopotamia, writing shifted from sacred geometry to simplified script. Complex ideograms gave way to phonetic wedges. Knowledge became transactional, not transcendent. This linguistic fragmentation spread outward. By 2500 BCE, every region of the Fertile Crescent had its own tongue, its own script, its own gods. The unity of the early world dissolved into a mosaic of rival kingdoms. Trade replaced communion. Where the Anunnaki had once ruled as intermediaries between heaven and earth, men now built empires in their image, competing for control of what fragments of the old order remained. The Sumerians lamented this change. The lament for Ur speaks of the gods abandoning their temples. The storm left the city desolate, its tongue was broken, its speech scattered to the winds. The text describes the burning of the Eker and the silencing of its bells. In the ruins, the scribes wrote, "Men spoke, but none were heard." The fall of the heavenly gate was not an act of divine anger, but of separation, the point where communication between realms failed completely. In Egypt, the same silence appears around the first intermediate period. The pyramid texts cease. The written word loses the voice of the gods and becomes administrative, legal, earthly. Hieroglyphs, once living symbols of cosmic forces, harden into statecraft. The sacred language of creation retreats into mystery schools and priestly codes. The Greeks would later call it the hieratic tongue language, reserved for ritual, unintelligible to ordinary ears. In myth, Babel becomes the emblem of pride. In history, it marks entropy, the slow fading of coherence. The unified science, geometry, and astronomy, inherited from the pre-flood world, fractured into regional knowledge. Babylonian astrology, Egyptian theology, and Indus mathematics all trace their roots to the same vanished source, but evolve apart, developing separate vocabularies for the same phenomena. The universal speech of the builders, the harmonics encoded in ratio and form, was forgotten. Yet echoes of that lost tongue persist in curious places. Across civilizations, sacred numbers recur. 360 for the degrees of the circle, 12 for the heavens, 7 for the wandering lights. These constants outlasted language. They may be the numerical residue of the old communication system symbols that could be understood across cultures when words could not. Even when languages changed, temples and ziggurats continued to reflect the same ratios. Architecture became the last surviving grammar of the gods. By the time of the Late Bronze Age, humanity had entered what modern historians call the Age of Correspondence. Empires wrote to each other in clay and papyrus, no longer to share wisdom, but to negotiate power. The Amarna letters of Egypt show kings addressing one another as brother, their words polite yet distrustful. The divine intermediaries were gone, only scribes remained. The Book of Jubilees, written millennia later, recalled that before Babel, all men spoke the tongue of creation. The phrase suggests a sound older than language, perhaps a vibrational code, remembered dimly as the voice of the gods. Some later mystics sought to recover it through chant and mathematics. The Pythagoreans spoke of the music of the spheres. The Sumerians had called it the song of the Abzu. Both may have been recollections of the same principle that the universe once spoke in harmony and that mankind once understood it. When that harmony broke, so did the link between heaven and earth. The fall of the heavenly gate was not the destruction of a tower, but of meaning itself. The scattered tongues became the walls of a new kind of world, one ruled by translation, misunderstanding, and distance. Civilization continued, but the speech of the gods had faded into myth. A late Babylonian fragment preserved at the Louvre ends with a brief line, written in Sumerian, though copied centuries after the language had died. The words rose like smoke, none knew their sound. It is the last trace of the old voice, drifting upward, dissolving into silence. The kings who remembered, long after the flood, when the memory of the old gods had faded into ritual and symbol, a few rulers claimed to remember. They spoke of a lineage that did not begin with men but with beings who measured the sky. These rulers called themselves the restorers, the bearers of the ancient covenant. In the ruins of Sumer and Egypt, their inscriptions still whisper the same phrases: chosen by the heavens, keeper of the tablets, the one who remembers. The first among them was Sargon of Akkad. His empire rose around 2330 BCE, uniting Sumer's fractured cities under one banner for the first time since the deluge myths had faded into silence. His scribes claimed he was not born of nobility, but set adrift in a basket upon the river, rescued by a gardener and raised by a goddess. The tale would later echo in the story of Moses. Yet Sargon's reign was defined by something older, his obsession with the stars. His capital, Agade, was said to be built by the design of the 7 sages, the Apkallu, who in the oldest tablets were the emissaries of Enki. In one surviving inscription, Sargon boasts, "The sun, the moon, and the stars obey my calendar." To modern scholars, this is metaphor. But under his rule, the Akkadians established the first standardized system of celestial observation, dividing the sky into degrees, naming planets, and timing harvests by lunar cycles. This rediscovery of astronomical order was not invention, it was reconstruction. Sargon's priests sought to recover the old rhythm between heaven and earth. After Sargon came his grandson, Naram-Sin. He proclaimed himself God of Akkad, wearing a horned crown once reserved for the Anunnaki. On his victory stele, he stands beneath a cluster of stars, trampling his enemies. The text describes him as ascending the mountain of the heavens. For this claim, later kings condemned him as cursed, saying he angered Enlil. The story of his punishment, the fall of Akkad into drought and ruin, mirrors an older cycle. The repeating descent from divine order into chaos whenever man reaches upward too far. In Egypt, the same remembrance took another form. The kings of the Old Kingdom called themselves sons of Ra, but within the temple walls they were known by another title, Sa and Jehuti, children of Thoth. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing and measurement, was said to have recorded the wisdom of the gods before the flood and restored it to mankind afterward. The priests of Heliopolis taught that every pharaoh who entered the afterlife passed through the hall of Thoth, where his heart was weighed not only against truth, but against memory, the measure of how faithfully he had preserved the divine order on earth. Some pharaohs took this charge literally. Khufu, builder of the Great Pyramid, called his monument Akhet Khufu, horizon of light. Its angles correspond precisely to the cardinal points. Its shafts align with the stars of Orion and Thuban. Modern engineers still debate how such accuracy was achieved with tools of copper and stone. The Egyptians said simply that it was built under the guidance of the star gods. Khufu's descendants recorded his dream of a heavenly stair, a vision of returning to the realm of the old king. The same concept had once guided the ziggurats of Sumer, the step between earth and sky. Across the Mediterranean, the memory travelled west. The early Greeks spoke of foreign teachers, Cadmios from the east, Danaus from Egypt, Orpheus from a land drowned by time. Their myths blend fragments of Mesopotamian theology with new names. Zeus inherits the role of Enlil, Prometheus mirrors Enki, and Hermes, the interpreter, becomes the echo of Thoth. By the 6th century BCE, philosophers like Pythagoras began to speak of a music of the spheres, the idea that planets move according to harmonic ratios. This was not speculation born from nothing. It was the revival of the ancient notion that the cosmos itself was a song and order to be remembered, not created. In Babylon, King Nabonidus restored the ziggurat of Haran, claiming in his inscription that it was the work of men before the flood. He wrote, "I found its foundation filled with bitumen and ancient bricks, inscribed with the name of Naram-Sin." He rebuilt it according to the original plan. Even in the late age of empires, rulers sought to reconnect with origins older than their own. The act of restoration became sacred, an imitation of creation. Among the priesthood, fragments of older knowledge survived through numbers. The Sumerians had used a base 6-0 system sexagesimal, where 60 and its multiples governed time, geometry, and measurement. The Egyptians used similar ratios in their pyramids and temple calendars. In Greece, the division of the circle into 360 degrees persisted unchanged. The same proportions appear in the Mayan calendar and in Vedic cosmology evidence of a shared arithmetic inherited from an unseen source. These were not coincidences. They were linguistic fossils of the divine order the kings tried to preserve. Occasionally, the old memory resurfaced more directly. The Assyrian king Esarhaddon, 681 BCE, rebuilt the temples of Babylon and wrote, "I laid the foundations deep into the waters. I placed within them tablets of silver, copper, gold, and lapis inscribed with the wisdom of before." He described finding buried inscriptions of the kings who lived before the flood. Whether real or imagined, his account suggests continuity, a lineage of rulers who saw themselves as caretakers of buried truth. By the time of Alexander, the language of the old gods had faded into symbolism. The conqueror, upon entering Egypt in 332 BCE, was greeted by priests who hailed him as the son of Amun, the same formula used for pharaohs since the Old Kingdom. When he journeyed to the oracle at Siwa, the priests addressed him as if he were returning, not arriving. Ancient inscriptions call the site the place of the first memory. Alexander left believing he had fulfilled prophecy. His empire would echo the pattern of the Anunnaki's domains, east to west, one sky above all. Within a decade, it too dissolved into fragments. Through all these empires, one thread remained constant: the belief that kingship was not merely political, but cosmic, a reenactment of a forgotten covenant. The Anunnaki had ruled in person, their human successors ruled by remembrance. Each claimed descent not of blood, but of memory. The gods had departed, but their geometry endured, measured in stars, carved in stone, encoded in the rhythm of calendars. A Babylonian text found in the ruins of Sippar closes this chain of inheritance. It reads, "The king is a shadow cast by the light of the old ones. When the light fades, the shadow forgets its shape." Those words mark the last recorded instance of the old cosmology before the rise of monotheism would erase its structure entirely. The kings who remembered became the final bridge, half human, half myth, standing at the threshold of an age that no longer looked upward for truth, but inward. The silence of the temples. By the end of the second millennium BCE, the great centers of the old world had fallen quiet. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia stood hollow, their stairways overgrown with dust. The temples of Thebes and Heliopolis, once filled with hymns and measurements of the stars, now echoed only with wind. Inscriptions that had once described the paths of the gods faded into unreadable marks. The voices that had bound heaven and earth had gone silent. The cycle that began in Eridu was ending. The decline was not sudden. It came like dusk, spreading slowly across centuries. In Sumer, the priests of Nippur still recited the hymns of Enlil, but their words no longer matched the sky. Precession had shifted the constellations. The stars no longer rose where the old tablets said they would. The calendar drifted, and with it the rituals that once renewed the covenant between heaven and earth. The gods, it seemed, had moved on to other stars. In Egypt, the same fading occurred. The high priests of Heliopolis kept the solar rites, yet fewer came to witness them. The once living science of the stars' geometry, resonance, harmonic proportion was replaced with ceremony. The rituals were performed, but their purpose forgotten. The priests still traced the movement of Orion and Sirius, yet when they raised their arms to greet the rising sun, it was habit, not communion. The mart, the balance of the world, became repetition. Records from the late period of Egypt describe a melancholy awareness of loss. The Demotic Chronicle laments, "The temples are as empty vessels, the gods have withdrawn their breath." The priests believed the divine essence, what they called Ka, had thinned in the air. They continued their processions, burning incense for statues that no longer spoke. In Thebes, the temple of Karnak grew silent after 1000 BCE. The astronomer priests still climbed the pylons to mark solstices, but the alignments no longer matched the heavens. The axis of the world had turned. Across Mesopotamia, the scribes copied texts they no longer understood. Cuneiform, once the sacred script of the gods, became a legal code and trade record. The libraries of Babylon and Nineveh preserved fragments of older wisdom, the star lists, omen tablets, and flood stories, but their language was ritual, not revelation. When Ashurbanipal wrote that he had read the writings of before the flood, he was likely the last to believe such words still held literal truth. After his death, even that belief turned to legend. The temples fell not by destruction, but by forgetting. As new empires rose, Persian, Greek, Roman, the old sanctuaries became monuments. Their altars were reused, their stones taken for walls. The temple of Esagila, once called the dwelling of Marduk, was stripped of its copper doors. The priesthood dispersed. carrying fragments of their astronomy to foreign lands. From their exile came the beginnings of new traditions: the Magi of Persia, the Chaldean astrologers, the Greek philosophers who spoke of divine numbers. Each carried an echo, a faint pulse of what had once been a living science. By 500 BCE, even the language of the Anunnaki was gone. Sumerian ceased to be spoken, surviving only as a scholar's tongue, its meanings guessed at by generations who copied signs they could no longer hear. The sacred words became marks on clay, silent, inert. In Egypt, hieroglyphs suffered the same fate. By the time of the Ptolemies, priests could no longer read the inscriptions on their own temple walls. The Rosetta Stone would one day restore their sound, but not their sense. The silence spread westward. The oracle at Delphi, once the navel of the world, fell mute under Roman rule. The flames in the temple of Vesta went out. The celestial harmony once measured by the Magi turned into astrology, divine geometry, simplified into prediction. The sacred numbers were retained, but their meaning reversed. What had been the study of balance became the search for fate. The philosopher Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, still remembered whispers of an older world. In the Timaeus, he described how the priests of Sais told Solon that humanity was young, and that many civilizations had risen and fallen before. He wrote of Atlantis, a city destroyed in a single day and night, set 9,000 years before his time. Whether he repeated an Egyptian tradition or glimpsed something older, his words mark the last clear echo of the flood memory in Western thought. After him, the silence deepened. When Alexander's armies reached Babylon, they found its ziggurats abandoned and its rivers choked with silt. The priests who remained told the conqueror that their gods had gone to the stars. He rebuilt the temple of Marduk out of respect, but his successors allowed it to fall again. By the 1st century BCE, the city was a ruin of reeds and brick. Strabo wrote that its walls are empty, its towers crumble into the plain. The gate of the gods had closed. In Egypt, the last hierophant of Heliopolis Ankh-Semthek performed the solar rite alone in 522 BCE. After him, the temples of Ra were deserted. The priesthood of Thoth retreated to small sanctuaries along the Nile Delta, translating their knowledge into Greek and Hebrew forms that would later surface in Hermetic and Gnostic texts. The gods depart to heaven, says the Hermetica, and the land is left to the race of mortals. The old voice, it seemed, had withdrawn entirely from earth. The Romans who came after mistook the silence for superstition. They took the statues and gold, but not the meaning. The temples became quarries, their star-aligned corridors stripped of purpose. By the time of Augustus, the pyramids were already ancient curiosities. Travellers carved their names on their stones, unaware that they were marking the tombs of an age that had once called itself divine. In the east, the remnants of the Mesopotamian priesthood fled toward Haran, keeping alive the rites of the moon god Sin. They were the last to use the title Kaldu, or Chaldean. By the 1st century CE, they too were gone. Their descendants, absorbed into new faiths, carried only traces the number systems, the geometry of sacred space, the calendar of solstices. The light of the old world dimmed into ritual sparks. An Assyrian tablet discovered in 1891 closes with a line few noticed. When the watchers ceased to measure, the heavens became strangers. It may be the final written thought of a dying tradition, a quiet acknowledgement that the cosmos no longer answered back. The gods who once ruled as kings had vanished, not in battle, but in silence. Humanity had inherited the earth, but without its map. By the time the last temple doors were sealed, the stars no longer marked divine will. They were distant, cold, and unknowable. The geometry that had once bound them to human life had been erased by time. What remained was memory encoded in myths, scattered in numbers, whispered in stone. The age of the Anunnaki had ended. leaving behind only architecture and awe. The temples stood empty, watching the night sky they no longer understood, the light beneath the ashes. There are ruins that do not end with stone. Beneath every mound, beneath every layer of sand and silt, there is a silence that still listens. The ancients called it Abzu, the deep that remembers. In our time, it is simply the unknown. Every myth, every fragment of clay, every echo of a vanished language points back to one place. A world that stood before the flood, before the stars shifted, before the long forgetting began. The fall of the last Anunnaki king was not just the loss of a ruler. It was the extinguishing of a bridge between sky and earth, between knowledge and faith, between memory and the living world. When the heavens burned and the rivers rose, the keepers of balance vanished into the dark, and what remained was humanity new, frightened, rebuilding from fragments it did not understand. And yet traces endure. Every temple raised to the sky, every pyramid aligned to stars no longer visible, every myth of beings who taught writing, metal and measure, whispers of continuity. The geometry of Eridu reappears in Egypt. The star maps of Babylon are mirrored in Greece. The gods change names, but their patterns stay the same measure: harmony, ascent. These are not coincidences. They are echoes of a memory so old it became instinct. When archaeologists unearth cuneiform tablets from the mud, the script feels almost alive. The wedges curve like river reeds, each pressed by a hand that once believed it was recording eternity. The words describe floods, kings, and the descent of knowledge. But sometimes, buried in the middle of trade lists and hymns, appears a single phrase: "We build as they built before the waters." No explanation follows. Only that quiet assertion, carved 5,000 years after the event it remembers. In 1947, in the caves of Qumran, scrolls wrapped in linen were found sealed inside clay jars. Among them, a fragment unlike the rest, a chronicle written in an older form of Aramaic. It speaks of watchers who measured the earth before it fell, and cities of the plain whose walls burned from within. Scholars call it apocryphal, but its vocabulary carries the cadence of Sumer. Even the word for king mirrors Lugal. The story repeats, stripped of divinity yet unchanged in essence. A time when wisdom walked among men and was lost to fire and flood. Science has uncovered its own version of that memory. In Greenland's ice cores, a thin black line marks the younger Dryas boundary soot, platinum, and ash from an impact that changed the planet. In the mud of Syria, the same layer appears. In the rock of North America, nanodiamonds tell of heat beyond comprehension. Every culture called it differently: judgment, cleansing, the anger of the sky. But the record is the same. Something immense struck the earth and reset the clock of civilization. Perhaps the kings who followed were not mythic at all, but witnesses those who survived and tried to preserve the map of the world that was. The ziggurats, the pyramids, the circles of Göbekli Tepe might not be monuments to gods, but memorials to what humanity once shared: the knowledge that order could exist between heaven and earth, if measured precisely. They built in stone because memory written in clay could be washed away. The ancients said that light never truly dies. It moves outward until it becomes silence. Somewhere in that silence lies the echo of their world, a faint signal in the background of ours. Every century, someone rediscovers a fragment, a forgotten alignment, a number that repeats across cultures, a legend that turns out to describe a real event. Slowly, the pattern reassembles. The flood, the kings, the watchers, the lost maps, they converge, not as fantasy, but as remembrance. The oldest Sumerian tablet ever found ends with a line so faint it can barely be read. It says, "What was hidden shall rise when the stars return to their places." The sky drifts through its precession cycle once every 26,000 years. Half that time, 13,000, has already passed since the last great fall. The stars are returning. The same constellations that watched the flood now rise again on our horizon. Perhaps that is why the buried lights call to us once more. The ruins awaken not with prophecy, but with memory. The dust of forgotten cities carries the reflection of a time when humankind was not alone in its knowledge. Whether the Anunnaki were gods, kings, or ancestors of our own lost age no longer matters. What endures is the pattern they left, the quiet geometry linking our temples, our calendars, our questions. The fall of the last Anunnaki king was not the end of their world. It was the beginning of ours. The flood receded, and we learned to speak, to build, to wonder. The silence of their temples became the language of our science. The same stars they measured now drift above our cities, waiting for us to remember why they mattered. The story ends where it began, with light, buried beneath ashes, waiting to be seen again. What if the ruins beneath our feet are not the beginning of history, but the remnants of something older, something humanity was never meant to forget? The floods came, the stars shifted, the languages broke apart, yet pieces of their world still echo through ours. The same alignments, the same numbers, the same questions. Perhaps the fall of the last Anunnaki king was not the end, but a reminder that civilizations rise and vanish like constellations, and that every age believes it will be the last until memory awakens again. If this journey through lost time spoke to you, help us keep exploring what lies beyond the edges of history. Like the video, subscribe for more stories buried beneath centuries of silence, and join us again next time where myth, science, and forgotten memory meet beneath the same ancient sky.